I'm Stewart Agras, a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Stanford University. I began to formulate my thoughts about the field of behavioral medicine while I was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences in 1976. At that time, the closest fields were psychosomatic medicine and consultation liaison psychiatry. Psychosomatic medicine was research-based, but didn't do very much in the clinical arena. And hence was an unlikely medium to influence medical practice. Consultation liaison psychiatry, on the other hand, was not research-based and hence did not introduce useful behavior change procedures for managing medical problems. It was evident that a new field was needed that would link basic research, clinical research and practice together, particularly focusing on the relation between behavior, health and illness. Hence, in 1976, we began a behavioral medicine program at Stanford focusing on non-pharmacologic approaches to the treatment of essential hypertension, using biofeedback, pain management, and treating overweight and obesity in both children and adults. This was a research and clinical program. This leads to the story about the formation of the Society of Behavioral Medicine, SBM. Now, the Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research had been founded in 1977. This was a society with a limited membership of researchers, actually initially limited to 100 individuals, and focused primarily on research. During one of those meetings, Mike Cataldo and I decided that a new society was going to be needed. This further became clear during my presidency of the Association for the Advancement of Behavior Therapy, AABT, in 1978, that a growing portion of the presentations at the annual meeting were focused on behavioral medicine themes, and that an organization similar to AABT to provide a forum for interchange between the researcher and clinician was needed. With the help of Mike Cataldo, a meeting was arranged to consider the formation of a new society during the annual meeting of AABT in Chicago on November 19, 1978. Attending the meeting were many future presidents of SBM, and a decision was made to go ahead with the society. I was elected the first president. This was a timely event because it brought together groups with somewhat disparate views of what behavioral medicine was about, both enabling and providing a wide enough umbrella to cover them all. If SBM had not been founded at that time, 4 or 5 competitive societies might well have emerged. It's important to note that without the help of AABT, the fledgling organization SBM would not have flourished. Indeed, AABT was taking something of a risk because it was possible that it would lose membership. In fact, this did not happen. However, AABT continued to provide much-needed administrative support during the first year of SBM's existence, helping with the organization, bylaws, and so on. Now, the next step, of course, was to organize the first annual meeting, which was held in conjunction with the AABT meeting in San Francisco, December 14th to 16th, 1979. We had no idea how many people would attend the meeting. Would it be 100 or 500? Because of the lead time, much of the program was invited. However, by the time of the meeting, over 600 individuals from a variety of professional backgrounds had already joined the society, and nearly 900 attended the first meeting, which was a great success. The society was on its way. The first program illustrates some of the hot areas in behavioral medicine at the time: type A behavior, current trends in clinical behavioral medicine, stimulus control of smoking, and the use of biofeedback. Perhaps one disappointment in the founding of SBM was that the Journal of Behavioral Medicine, which was already going at that time, elected to stay separate from the society. However, the Society Steering Committee decided to begin a journal publishing abstracts relevant to the field of behavioral medicine, with commentary on some of the more pertinent papers. It was called, of course, the Annals of Behavioral Medicine, which gradually evolved to its present form. The abstracts were, however, most useful in helping to define the new field, because relevant papers were published across a wider variety of journals than most professionals would read. Moreover, it underlined the essential element of linking different aspects of research with each other and with clinical management. Another issue that was debated early on in the Society was whether SBM should have a parallel organization for members of the public interested in health behavior. Eventually it was decided that this would be too much for a young society to take on. Now that SBM is a mature society, what's the most pressing issue facing the society? As I look down the list of officers, council chairs and committee chairs of SBM, I find one MD and one nurse out of 21 positions. If we wish to influence the way in which medicine cares for patients or encourages healthy behaviors, then this proportion appears unfortunate. I would say that one of the most pressing issues facing SBM is how to bring what we know about empirically tested behavior change procedures to the practice of medicine. It would be nice to think that the practice of medicine has changed and incorporated such procedures over the 25 years of the existence of SBM, but I believe the changes have in fact been few. Of course, the practice of medicine is complex and has also changed much over the past 25 years. We know a great deal about the risk factors for various diseases and how to moderate them to achieve better health, but remarkably few physicians do anything about prevention, as I think demonstrated by the growing epidemic of obesity. We also know a good deal about empirically validated behavior change procedures, but they are rarely applied within the practice of medicine. Perhaps we now need research on the problems involved in the introduction of these procedures into medical practice. This may also involve consideration of the financial roadblocks to the use of some of these procedures, for example, health promotion, specific prevention technologies, and may also require working with health insurers. Thank you.
I'm Joe Brady, one of the founding fathers of the Society of Behavioral Medicine and its second president. I've been asked to say a few words, make a few comments for this 25th anniversary archive. I've made a few notes, obviously, to cover the points that I've been asked to cover. First, of course, I am currently a professor of behavioral biology and professor of neuroscience, as well as the director of the Behavioral Biology Research Center at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. That's my current position, and that was my position when the society started 25 years or so ago. I came to behavioral medicine through the animal experimental route, actually. I was at Walter Reed Neuropsychiatry Laboratories for 20 years and became dramatically impressed with the profound effects of behavioral interactions upon the physiology of the organism, upon its cardiovascular system, upon its endocrine system, upon its gastrointestinal system. As a matter of fact, I was involved in the ulcers in executive monkeys story many, many years ago. When I came to Johns Hopkins, shortly after my arrival, I found myself as the acting chair of the Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Joel Elkes had heard the call to higher service and became a distinguished service professor. And I was acting as chair for a year or more while they searched for a new chair. During that time, I felt that my friends and relatives who I had left back in the laboratories should be contributing more than they were, since I was paying my dues. So I invited them over to the headquarters, to the Phipps Clinic, and we started the behavioral medicine clinic at that time. There are, of course, many war stories associated with that behavioral medicine clinic and its origins. But perhaps the most important challenge that came upon our involvement with many of there were just a few other groups in the country in the behavioral medicine business at that time, Stewart Agras, of course, and Ovid Pomelo, Paul Brady in Philadelphia, and of course our associations with Dr. Abel and the people at the AABT. We decided at that point that we would start the Society of Behavioral Medicine. Perhaps the biggest challenge of my tenure as president, of course, was our Declaration of Independence. We decided that the society should have its own headquarters and own office. And we established that right here at Johns Hopkins in the Phipps Clinic with Joan Woodward as our first executive secretary, and we thought it only fitting and proper that the Johns Hopkins Phipps Clinic should be that headquarters, since it was the base where the behaviorism essentially had its very beginnings right here, and some of the early students of behaviorism, Kurt Richter, were still holding forth at the time. As I said, there are a number of war stories associated with both the establishment of the clinic and the beginnings of the Society of Behavioral Medicine, but there is not time to cover those now. Okay, as I say, I think it was quite fitting that the first headquarters of the Society of Behavioral Medicine be here in the Phipps Clinic, where John B. Watson held forth many, many years ago, the father of behaviorism, and one of his students, Kurt Richter, was still present and very active in the building when we started things for behavioral medicine. One of the things I've been asked to comment on is a perhaps humorous anecdote. Early in the development of both our behavioral medicine clinic here at Hopkins in the bastion of elite medicine and the establishment of the Society of Behavioral Medicine's headquarters, I had a visit from an old friend, Danny Friedman, who was the chairman of the psychiatry department at the University of Chicago. As Danny was walking through the halls here at the Phipps, right across from my chairman's office, he saw a sign which we had hung up over one of the rooms called Behavioral Medicine. And Danny looked at that and said, "What is this behavioral medicine?" I explained to him that we had started a clinic. He said, "It sounds like something you give kids when they're bad." That was his take on behavioral medicine. My suspicion is that much of psychiatry's take hasn't changed all that much over the years on the behavioral medicine story. Personally, I have probably strayed a bit from the party line in the behavioral medicine field, and I developed some concerns that the field had perhaps too much medicine and not enough behavior, and I began to feel that, quotes, rather than behavior as an experimental science, that pop psychology was beginning to creep back in here and there. I have, however, remained at least on the periphery of the field. I've been involved in drug abuse, which, although despite a lot of the funny talk about brain disease, the dominant features of the drug abuse field are clearly behavioral, and it is, in my expression at least, a rather important part of the behavioral medicine field. I have also had been involved in a recent renaissance, shall we say, of the behavioral medicine field under a new label. We're now called behavioral health, which I find a little more palatable. It fits nicely with an upgrade look of the behavioral medicine field. And I have just spent two years on a National Academy of Sciences committee sponsored by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and we were concerned with astronaut health during long-duration missions. We're talking sending some of these folks off for 2 to 3 years at a time in a small box, and one of the focus, or an important focus of that committee meeting and an important part of the report was the behavioral health, which I have indicated as the propedeutic requirement for long-duration health in astronauts on such missions. So I guess finally I would say, asked where do I see the field going in the future and what would be my advice to the youngsters coming on up is simply ever onward and upward.
Hello, I'm Gene G. Abel, MD, Director of the Behavioral Medicine Institute in Atlanta, President of Software Company, and Professor of Clinical Psychiatry at Emory University School of Medicine and also at Morehouse School of Medicine. How did I get involved in behavioral medicine? There's really two routes. I was attached to AABT, which I consider probably the parent organization of the Society of Behavioral Medicine. And there I learned a lot about behavioral modification. But I had a better advantage in that my first academic position was at the University of Mississippi when Stewart Agras was chair, and he was my mentor. But he brought together a number of really crackerjack behavioral mod people at that university. Ed Blanchard, Dave Barlow, Michelle Hershen, Len Epstein, and Dick Eisler. I had the opportunity to work around those individuals, which was really helpful. Now, I was president in 1980, and what had happened with AABT was that there were so many presentations and papers at AABT dealing with behavioral medicine issues that it was kind of making AABT lopsided. And as a result, Society of Behavioral Medicine grew right out of that lopsidedness into its own organization. The greatest accomplishment, at least as I see it during that time, was to maintain stability of the organization when it was so young. The greatest frustration, however, was the loss of connections and friends at AABT. The greatest challenge, of course, was this instability issue. I was asked to make some amusing anecdote that I recall. Well, I don't have one, except that in retrospect, I would say being president of SBM at that time was a lot like shooting skeet from a surfboard. The most pressing issues, I think, at this time, at least from my view of all of this, is how to maintain our professional identity when we're looking at multidisciplinary issues, cross-cultural, cross-national issues, while still focusing on public health and public health approaches to maintain our center. Advice I would give is to the younger people. First, surround yourself with the best mentors you can find. I was lucky in that regard. Second, select an area that you become an expert on. Pick an area that is unresearched or very little research, that has potentially a large number of patients or clients with that particular problem. I think what you don't do is probably just as important as what you do. That is, you can't do everything, and you have to set aside some things, and that allows you to move forward in other areas. While I was in medical school, I had a friend whose philosophy was press on with unbound confidence. I think that can be helpful to everyone, because I believe tenacity will win the day. A one-word description of my presidency was fun. I love trying to hold together a kind of a chaotic situation. The greatest challenge, I believe, for SBM is to maintain our center while still trying to look at broad problems across the culture. Where's the future going? I believe because we can communicate over the internet, I think multinational studies are in order. As a matter of fact, if you're watching this in the meeting in Baltimore, at the same time I'm presenting in Istanbul, Turkey, on a public health plan to prevent child molestation. Good wishes to you all.
Hi, I'm Mike Cataldo. I'm professor of behavioral biology at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. I also run a behavioral program at the Kennedy Krieger Institute. In terms of my relationship to the Society of Behavioral Medicine, I was president the last time the Society had its meeting here in Baltimore. So the return of the Society to Baltimore is a very welcome event. My purpose today is to tell you two things: how the Society began, and what might be learned from the Society's beginnings. Behavioral medicine was an idea whose time had come around the time when we wanted to start the Society. And it's an idea that had several different initiatives, a few of which saw the light of day. For example, Steve Weiss started several initiatives down at NIH, and another group started the Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research. And in fact, it was out of the Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research that the Society was spawned. Let me tell you how that happened. There was a meeting in Washington at the National Academy of Sciences, and during that meeting, the group decided to form the Academy of Behavioral Medicine. They also decided that it would be a closed organization, not open to new members except by invitation. At the end of that meeting, Stewart Agras and I said, now is the time for an open membership organization, therefore the Society of Behavioral Medicine. But it needed to have a home that would nurture it for a while, so the Society was organized and run initially within the framework of AABT, which I was currently running at the time. And after a year or so, the Society prospered, and the members and the executive group of the Society thought it was time to move out of AABT. So we moved it to Johns Hopkins, where Joe Brady and myself shepherded it through the next few years with the help of my then secretary, who was Jude Woodward. Jude Woodward, as you know, became the executive director of the Society, moved it to Tennessee, and nurtured its existence there. Let me tell you the two most important points that I learned from this early history. The first was that there was a constant debate about what behavioral medicine really was. Many people wanted it to be a discipline in and of itself. In my opinion, it's not a discipline. It's an integration of several different scientific areas and several different disciplines so as to better understand and treat health problems. I suspect that concern with what behavioral medicine really is still exists today. Second point I'd like to make from this early history is one that was relevant to the Society and is also relevant to other organizations that I've been involved with, and it has to do with what an organization like this is really for. It's really a vehicle for being able to make change and being able to make something happen in a scientific field. And the two barriers to that are the domination by one group of professionals who think the Society or an organization like the Society should be run by them. That's very dangerous and needs to be avoided. The other barrier is the domination by the staff, who think that the organization is theirs rather than the members or the different disciplines. So that is a brief history, according to Mike Cataldo, of the Society of Behavioral Medicine. I'm very glad to have had this opportunity to speak with you. Enjoy the convention. Welcome to Baltimore.
Well, I'm Dr. Redford Williams. I'm currently professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at Duke University Medical Center. Also have an appointment as professor of medicine in the Department of Medicine and professor of psychology. Also, I have an adjunct appointment at the University of North Carolina in epidemiology, and I'm the director of the Behavioral Medicine Research Center here at Duke. Actually, my introduction to behavioral medicine began when I was taking a freshman seminar at Harvard in 1959. They had these freshman seminars that was an educational experiment for the first time ever. And there were two that interested me. One was political science, taught by a then obscure political scientist named McGeorge Bundy, and the other was in behavioral science, taught by then obscure and still now deceased, bless his heart, behavioral scientist George Goethals. I didn't make it into the political science one, but I did get into the behavioral science one. Actually, if I made it into the political science one, I probably wouldn't be sitting here talking to you right now. But the first paper assignment was to write a paper. We had to write a paper every week. And George's first assignment to us was to write us a paper on the mind-body problem. And I think I'm probably still working on that assignment. I haven't finished it yet, but I'm still working on it. I probably won't ever finish, but it's been an exciting time to work on it. Other mentors were still at Harvard, Stan King, who was director of the Harvard Student Study at that time, and John Spiegel, both of whom helped me with my senior thesis. And then at Yale in medical school, Pat McKegney was a mentor for me. We did a lot of research looking at blood pressure reactivity to stress. And then at NIMH, I'd consider Irv Copen a mentor. He helped me really get into the neuropharmacology, the biology, the neurobiology area that has been so important to me. I think the most significant challenge that I faced as president was in the process of trying to reach out to other scientific societies, not just the ones that are obvious, not just the ones that are obvious like American Psychosomatic Health Psychology, but other disease-oriented societies like American Heart, American College of Cardiology. We ended up developing a plan to have our annual meeting as a joint meeting with the American Diabetes Association, the ADA. And I was very excited about it. I think my greatest achievement would be two things. First, again, in the mode of reaching out, was to establish a new corporate membership category. I felt that we could, by having a membership category for corporations that could be sustaining corporate members, that this would be a way of providing us with ongoing support. And indeed, during the course of my presidency and in the following year, this new class of membership was established. And if you look at the bylaws, I think you'll see that we still have a corporate membership category that corporations can join and be sustaining for, $5,000, $10,000 a year sort of thing. We may want to consider reactivating that. It's not been actively pursued. The other achievement I'm very proud of during my presidency was that we added, during a long-range planning meeting that was held at Arley House, a new goal, which is to translate our science into practical application in the medical care delivery systems in this country, so that our mission statement added to the science, added to have behavioral approaches to be practiced. Well, actually, during my presidency, nothing funny happened. Everything was totally deadly serious the whole time. I think here there are two areas. One is on the scientific side. I think the challenge is going to be for SBM and our field in general to be able to incorporate the genetic revolution, the genomic revolution, and what we are learning there into our science. I think we have a tremendous potential to be able to identify, using genetic approaches, people who are at particularly high risk to suffer the consequences of chronic stress, for example, on their health. And I think if we can identify people on the basis of genetic variation who are at high risk, who are very susceptible to effects of stress, I think we would be able to get to the point of being able to justify even primary prevention approaches in behavioral medicine, because you've got a high-risk group where the event rate is going to be sufficiently high that you don't have to study thousands of people. So I think this is going to be an opportunity and a challenge. I think the other is, again, this thing of translating our science into practical approaches to prevention and treatment in the real world, the HMOs, the managed care situation, corporate health programs. I think this is an absolutely critical thing that we've got to do. We do this research so we can help improve the health, and I think we've got to figure out ways to translate the research into treatment, prevention approaches that can be used in the real world and not just in big multi-center clinical trials. I think that the most important thing, if you're a younger person just starting out in the field of behavioral medicine, is to have a dream, to think of a problem that you would like to solve, And don't worry about a technique, don't worry about a discipline, but think of a problem you'd like to solve. It may be the problem of bereavement, it may be the problem of caregiver, being a caregiver, it may be the problem of heart disease or cancer, whatever it is. Think of a problem and then learn whatever you have to learn to work toward a solution of that problem. Go wherever you have to go to get the technique, the skills that you have to learn, but have the problem in mind and not the techniques or the discipline. So if I had to pick one word or a phrase to characterize my presidency, it would be reaching. If I had to choose one word or phrase to characterize the challenges that SBM faced during my presidency, it would be growth and finances. And if I had to pick one word for SBM in the future, it would be plastics. No, it would be genetics. If I had to pick one word that would kind of be my wish for SBM in the future, it would be genetics.
Well, welcome to the 25th anniversary of the Society of Behavioral Medicine Town Hall meeting. I'm Stephen Weiss. I'll be your moderator for the next hour. And before we begin, though, I'd like to just share with you a few old photos that I came across that talk to us a little bit about the beginnings of behavioral medicine. The first photo you see on the screen is Neal Miller. Neal was a beloved figure to so many of us, and so many of us were his disciples, and it was a very sad occasion of his death a year and a half ago, but we had a wonderful celebration of his life just last year up at Yale. The second person, Margaret Chesney. Margaret is, of course, well known to many of us from UCSF, and has been a leading light and is now at NIH as the Associate Director for the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine, which is a wonderful thing for behavioral medicine. Gary Schwartz was, of course, one of the co-originators of the term behavioral medicine, and was my co-chair. We were co-chairs at the Yale Conference on Behavioral Medicine back in 1977, when the idea of a Society of Behavioral Medicine was still kind of a speck in the eye of its creators. Neal Schneiderman. Neal, although never a president of the organization, has been a leading light in behavioral medicine and has been a prime mover in the International Society of Behavioral Medicine. And it's perhaps a loss to the society that he hasn't been the president, which he should certainly be one of these days before he gets even older than I am. Stewart Agras. Of course, Stewart was the first president of the society, and you see him here at a conference in which many of these pictures were taken. That was at the Institute of Medicine, which was, again, the second conference to actually that resulted in the formation of both the Society of Behavioral Medicine and the Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research. Joel Dimsdale. Joel, of course, was a former president of the organization and from UCSD, and has been, again, a very important figure in the development and the continuance of behavioral medicine, and is best known also as the editor of Psychosomatic Medicine. Tom Pickering from Cornell was very helpful during the formative years, and again, former president of the organization. And Redford Williams from Duke University, and also head of the Behavioral Medicine Research Center at Duke, a former past president of the organization, has been a mainstay of behavioral medicine and behavioral medicine research. And finally, Joe Brady, and the guy talking with Joe Brady in this picture, you see, of course, at a time which much younger for both of us, but this was also at that Institute of Medicine meeting that was hosted by David Hamburg at the IOM back in 1978. So that's just a very brief orientation to some of the people who were the prime movers in the development of behavioral medicine, and of course I guess I represent in a way some of the earlier times, and of course When the organization first began, I knew almost everyone in the organization, and today, of course, it's a much larger organization. I'm a lot older, and of course, there are a lot of new faces, which of course is the major wellspring of any vibrant organization, as is the Society of Behavioral Medicine. Okay, well, my name is Stephen Weiss. I'm currently the professor and vice chair for research in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Miami School of Medicine, as you can see from my little guy up here. I came down to Florida after leaving NIH in 1993, retired to come down to Florida to take it easy, and unfortunately they had other plans in mind for me. So here I am, still working full-time. How did I first get involved with behavioral medicine? Well, that's kind of a long story. Probably the first activity in this area was when I did my dissertation research on open heart surgery and psychological factors involved in recovery from open heart surgery at the University of Oregon Medical School back in the early 60s. That's when open heart surgery was very new, and they were losing a lot of patients, but they were also having some very unusual responses to the surgery, behavioral responses, and the surgeons wanted to know why. And I had a mentor at the time, Joe Matarazzo, who was chairman of the Department of Medical Psychology, and he was perhaps my primary inspiration in finally getting involved in the more biomedical side of health as opposed to the more mental health side. And behavioral factors in chronic disease became a primary interest of mine. I went to Johns Hopkins, my first real job in behavioral medicine, and worked with transsexual surgery people, with the OBGYN groups, plastic surgeons, with the cardiology folks, and it was a very exciting time. I decided, though, to take a little time and do something that I had always wanted to. I went and worked with the Peace Corps for several years, first in Washington and then in Africa, and then returned in 1974 to come to the NIH, where I became chief of what ultimately became the behavioral medicine branch in the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. There was a 3-year period, however, from the time I came until the program was formally named behavioral medicine, and that was a very formative time for behavioral medicine. We really didn't quite know what to call this area, but we did want to encourage and stimulate research and to develop a very active and vibrant research program. But we really had to give it a name, it had to have a constituency, there had to be many things involved in ultimately gaining a foothold in the NIH establishment. And one of those was to develop organizations that would represent this field. So in 1977, Gary Schwartz and I co-hosted the Yale Conference on Behavioral Medicine. Now, it was first just called the Yale Conference. We really didn't have the term behavioral medicine really in hand. It was one of several possibilities. Ultimately, the conference participants decided that behavioral medicine was the best term to describe what we did, and so it became the Yale Conference on Behavioral Medicine. About a year later, a year and a half later actually, we held another meeting at the Institute of Medicine, hosted by Dr. David Hamburg, who was president of the Institute of Medicine at the time, which is part of the National Academy of Sciences. And we were given the boardroom, a very, very elaborate room in which very serious deliberations were held. We were very impressed. And we actually, 30 or so of us, deliberated for 3 days, trying to come up with a more functional definition of behavioral medicine, and then also what were the next steps we should take. And at that time it was decided that 2 organizations would best represent the needs of behavioral medicine: the Society of Behavioral Medicine and the Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research. And so that was perhaps the first beginnings, and right at that same time we did
had the branch, the newly formed branch at that time. We reorganized the branch. It was called the Behavioral Medicine Branch, and we began working very actively towards developing a major program of biobehavioral research at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and ultimately at many other institutes within the NIH. What was the most significant accomplishment during my tenure as president? Well, there were many things happening. The organization was about 5 years old at that point, and we were just kind of going from adolescence into adulthood, or perhaps childhood into adolescence, hard to tell. But one of the things that I found that most organizations needed to establish themselves, at least as a serious research group, is a journal. And we had a newsletter that was kind of on the verge of a journal because it had certain trappings of a journal, but it was still basically a newsletter. And I guess the most important thing was to actually transform that to what ultimately became the Annals of Behavioral Medicine, today a very well-respected journal in the field of both medicine and psychology and behavioral science. The most significant challenge to this particular period of time, I believe, was to broaden and to expand the interdisciplinary character of our organization. We did not wish to be an organization solely of anything, not solely psychologists, not solely psychiatrists, not solely physicians, not solely nurses, but a representation from each field, both from a clinical standpoint, from a research standpoint, and from a teaching training standpoint. This was very critical to really succeeding in becoming a truly interdisciplinary organization. We wanted to be not just a multidisciplinary organization, which meant many disciplines which could be engaging in parallel play, but truly interdisciplinary, in which the interaction between the disciplines would produce approaches to problems which were actually synergistic in terms of attempting to address that problem, where the whole would truly be more and greater than the sum of its parts. The most pressing future challenge to the organization remains broadening and expanding the interdisciplinary character of the Society of Behavioral Medicine. We are a vibrant organization. We are multidisciplinary and we are interdisciplinary, but we still need to place major emphasis on continuing to recruit those disciplines which are not adequately represented today. Certainly many of these areas in biomedicine and in basic science and physiology are not as well represented as they could be. In certain areas we may have overrepresentation, such as in psychology. When I was the chair of the Scientific Liaison Committee, what we tried to do was to bring other disciplines. We primarily were focused on trying to recruit people from other disciplines so that we could create a truly interdisciplinary group. And I think this remains a major challenge to the organization, and that should be an area which we concentrate our primary efforts as growing this organization into what it truly is today, but also can become in the future. We also need to expand our mission from not only basic science and clinical science, but also into the public health aspects of health and disease, both the prevention of chronic disease as well as the treatment of disease. And so health promotion becomes a major concern of our organization, of the membership in the organization, and we should maintain its salience to the group by ensuring that we are addressing these kinds of issues as part of our mission. I was asked to think of some anecdote that occurred during my involvement with the Society of Behavioral Medicine, and one of my earliest memories was when the society was formed, it was formed as actually a part of the Association for the Advancement of Behavior Therapy. Now, many of us certainly acknowledge the contribution that behavior therapy had made to behavioral medicine, but we really consider behavioral medicine to be much broader than behavior therapy. And so the first meeting of the Society of Behavioral Medicine were a couple of pages that were placed right in the centerfold of the Association for the Advancement of Behavior Therapy's annual conference. And we thought that was quite telling, because many of us were invited to say to a meeting in which we were asked to share our views about how we could best grow the organization. And what the primary message of that was is, well, the first thing you have to do is become an independent group. Well, that didn't happen. And about halfway into the following year, Mike Follick, who was the editor of the newsletter at the time, called me and asked if I would be willing to do kind of an op-ed piece. And I said I would, with one condition, that there be no editorial oversight of what I had to say, no editing. He agreed to that, and so I sent in the piece. And the piece basically said, when is the Society of Behavioral Medicine going to grow up and stand on its own feet? I used the analogy of the little kid who said, I'd run away from home if my mommy would only let me cross the street. And I asked every member who felt as I did to send a $100 check, and I sent the first one, to Mike to be used as a little war chest to assist the newly fledgling Society of Behavioral Medicine separate from its, quote, parent organization, and to develop its own identity. Well, there was a fair amount of discussion about that, and Mike called me and said, are you sure you want me to print this? I said, absolutely. And so he did, and lo and behold, there was a board meeting that was held. Several brickbats were thrown in my direction, as I understand. I wasn't there, but there were a few people who had some things to say about that. But the final result was that, in fact, they did decide that for one reason or another, not necessarily because of my letter, but apparently it did stir the pot sufficiently so that the organization did split off. And so I thought, well, you know, it was $100 well spent. They actually sent the check back to me. Okay, I was asked what advice I might give to someone newly interested or newly involved in behavioral medicine, whether they be student or they be established person who wants to expand their horizons. I would say the important thing for the student is to get well trained in your own discipline. Become first-rate in your own discipline, and then learn the language and culture of the other disciplines associated with behavioral medicine. Don't become too broad initially. Really learn your specialty, because that will be your ultimate contribution as you expand your horizons once you've received your basic primary training. So train in your discipline and then expand beyond that. Take seminars, take courses, take workshops, do a fellowship, whatever. And understanding the languages so that one can establish a common form of communication that speaks to both biomedicine and all the sub-areas associated with that, and the behavioral and social sciences and all the sub-areas. Because we need to become familiar with what happens in basic science in terms of understanding mechanism. We need to understand the clinical research and the clinical applications of our activities. We also need to be sensitive to and promotive of public health aspects of what we do. So both the basic science, the clinical, public health aspects of both treatment as well as prevention of disease. Finally, let me leave you with one comment, and it's one that I've used many times, and many of Neal Miller's students have done the same. Neal had one adage that he always closed his talks with. Be bold in what you try, be cautious in what you claim. I think if we all keep that in mind, we will do good science, we will do good clinical work, and hopefully we will also excel in health promotion and disease prevention. Thank you.
My name is Michael Follick, and I am the president and CEO of the Abacus Group in Providence, Rhode Island. I was the president of the Society of Behavioral Medicine from 1986 to 1987. My interest in the field of behavioral medicine began when I was a graduate student at the University of Iowa. I was very interested in the early work of Neal Miller in the area of operant autonomic conditioning. And I started to work, my research was with the University of Iowa Medical, the gastroenterology department, where we were looking at operant autonomic conditioning, and particularly gastrointestinal motility. My interest in this area took me then to the University of Minnesota, where I interned in a program called health psychology, and I entered that program specifically for my interest in health psychology. They had a program there that was modeled, the pain program that was modeled after Bill Fordyce's operant management of chronic pain in Seattle. And Alan Roberts and company ran that program, and it was in the physical medicine and rehabilitation department. So the University of Minnesota afforded me the exposure to the areas of which I had the greatest interest. I was recruited to Brown by David Barlow, who was interested in this emerging area, which had just begun to get defined, I guess, around the 1976-77 timeframe. And I was recruited to focus specifically on the development of that, and joined Harold Musiker, who had a biofeedback lab here at Rhode Island Hospital. I was at the Miriam Hospital, where I was to build the program in behavioral medicine throughout Brown's consortium of hospitals. That program actually began I came in 1977, that program began in 1978, and within our first group of students was David Abrams. And therein begins a long and rich history of Brown's program in behavioral medicine. We launched our clinics in 1978 at the Miriam Hospital, and they grew, and David has expanded the Center for Behavioral Medicine now, although I left it in 1988. David has expanded that program to a monstrous proportion. And Rena Wing is now part of the program at Brown, and the program has just really become very substantial in scope. Rena R is a part of this program, and the number of people that have contributed to the success and growth of behavioral medicine at Brown is too numerous to mention. But there have been, and there continues to be, lots of great people here at Brown, and we're very pleased with the program that we have at Brown. The annual program, I remember, I was very excited about. We had a great time at that meeting, and if I remember the title, I believe it was A Cost-Effective Approach to Improving Health Status. And we had I remember distinctly, we had Peter Herbert and the Diet Heart debate. And it was a very successful format, I remember, because we had two opposite ends of the spectrum debating each other on the issue of cholesterol management and the behavioral components of cholesterol management. I remember that being a very entertaining session, at least to me it was anyway. Well, I can remember, I'll tell you one thing that sticks out vividly in my mind. In the early days when we were establishing the society, we had a series of meetings and we were away at a board meeting, and we had to get people pulled together, and for some reason I had to go and contact Joe Brady, and his room was in the hotel as well. We had something going on that evening, and I remember having to go up to his room to pick something up or whatever, and I knocked on his door, and Joe Brady comes to the door in his underwear. He is sitting in front of the television watching the football game, eating his dinner. And he's sitting there in his underwear, and he approaches the door in his underwear. And I told him, and I said that this is an image that I will not quickly forget. And I have, to this date, not forgotten that image. I feel the most pressing question in front of us now, and the issues that we have to address, is that we have to answer a key question. And that is, we have to determine how we fit into the healthcare system of the future. Our healthcare system is about to undergo its most dramatic set of changes that we have ever seen. It's on the verge of a rapid evolution. And we really should ask how we're, not so much how we're going to fit in today's healthcare delivery system, but what is the next healthcare system, what is the healthcare system of the future going to look like, and how do we contribute to that system, and how do we fit into that system? And even better yet, how do we help evolve it? We really need to think out of the box. We can't be looking at the same CPT code models. We can't be looking at the same individual patient care models. We have to be thinking about how we leverage new technology, how we, to promote behavior change, how we fit into the delivery system in a unique and different way than we do now. We have a lot to contribute, and everyone is in agreement that people's behavior is at the root of the changes. Everyone's behavior needs to change, and everyone will agree with that. The question is, what does that structure look like that promotes and fosters the most appropriate behavior change? I think that's the most pressing question in front of us, and that we need to also capitalize on the economic evolution and make sure that we can build the business case for our contribution. I'm going to argue that we have very exciting time ahead of us. We have tremendous opportunity ahead of us, and this period of change is going to create some unique opportunities. And I believe that in addition to understanding and getting a thorough grasp of the content base and the evidence base that has been developed in the last 20 years, students should also, and those entering the field should also, one, understand healthcare delivery system and how it works. They should understand healthcare insurance and healthcare financing. Those are very important factors to helping to answer questions about how and where we're going to fit in the future. They need to understand some basic business principles. It doesn't matter whether you like it or not, we're part of an economic system that has to be built on a business platform. You got to understand aspects of business. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, you need to be creative. You really need to think out of the box, and you need to push the limits. And develop relationships with people that are not just your own peers. Develop relationships with finance people in healthcare, administrators in healthcare, deliverers of healthcare, integrated delivery systems. Develop all kinds of relationships and determine new ways to transfer your knowledge base and your value to the healthcare delivery system of the future. I think it's an exciting time ahead, and the sky's the limit at many levels. So enjoy the process.
Hi, I am Rena Wing. I was the president of SBM in the years 1992-93. I was asked to tell you a little bit about myself and some of my career, and then a little bit about my time as president of SBM. At this point in time, I'm a professor of psychiatry and human behavior at Brown Medical School, and I'm also the director of the Weight Control and Diabetes Research Center, which is a research center connected with Miriam Hospital, one of the two primary teaching hospitals at Brown University. My interest really throughout my entire career has been weight control, obesity, behavioral treatment of obesity specifically. People ask me often how I got interested in this topic, and I think it was really a mixture of just different situations and circumstances. I was doing my dissertation and postdoctoral fellowship at the time when Stanley Schachter's approaches to obesity were very prominent. People were talking about externality and internal aspects of obesity. And I began to study some of those components of externality of obesity with David Shapiro as my PhD advisor and postdoctoral advisor. We began doing some psychophysiological studies on obesity. I was also very fortunate that in the early 70s, when I was doing my research, was really the beginning of the behavioral treatment of obesity. I moved out to Stanford and happened to become acquainted with Dr. Robert Jeffrey, who was running the eating disorders program at Stanford, and he agreed to allow me to serve as a co-therapist with him, leading behavioral weight control treatment groups. As I say, this was at the very beginning of behavioral treatment. And he and I did many different groups together as part of this eating disorders clinic, and then decided that we should sit back and analyze how our patients had done in this clinic. That became the first paper that I ever published, a paper with Bob Jeffrey analyzing the results of our patients in this eating disorders clinic at Stanford. Bob and I found we had about a 10-pound weight loss with our patients, and we weren't very excited. So the next thing we did was to begin to compare how we had done with other published literature. How did other people do with behavioral treatments? How did they do with diet? How did they do with exercise? And that became my second paper, really looking at how our behavioral treatments did compared to other approaches. Bob Jeffrey actually has been a lifelong friend, and we've continued to do research together over the years. And I would say that he's really been one of the important influences in my career. Another person who's had a very important influence in my career has been Dr. Leonard Epstein. Len and I happened to arrive together at the University of Pittsburgh towards the end of the 1970s, 77, 78. We found ourselves both there, both interested in studying obesity, and we sat down together and we said, well, how are we going to divide this topic so that we're not stepping on each other's toes? And we decided that an easy way to divide it would be to say, one of us do childhood obesity, the other one do adult obesity. And I had young kids at home at the moment, and I didn't want to come to work and study children. So I said to Len, you study childhood obesity and I'll study adults. He said, okay with him. And as many of you know, Len Epstein has become one of the preeminent researchers in childhood obesity. And hopefully I've helped contribute to adult obesity. But really, that's how the two of us decided our areas, just on this simple decision to separate, not so we wouldn't be stepping on each other's toes. One of the key turning points in my own career was when I moved from the topic of obesity to the relationship between obesity and type 2 diabetes. I'd been studying obesity until then, and everyone kept saying, isn't obesity just a cosmetic problem? So I was really looking for an area where obesity was clearly a medical problem, and I hit upon type 2 diabetes. Interestingly, at that point I knew nothing about diabetes, and I just actually went and read some medical textbooks and endocrine books and learned about diabetes, and that launched my whole career on obesity and diabetes. I've pursued that area over the years, initially doing studies just looking at how behavioral work approaches helped in the treatment of diabetes, then looking at exercise or home blood sugar monitoring as components of the behavioral program. Later, I moved more into the area of preventing diabetes through behavioral treatments for obesity. If you asked me what the single most exciting moment in my career has been, I would tell you it was when the diabetes prevention program results were announced. I just want to tell you a little bit about the diabetes prevention program and why, as a behaviorist, it would be such an exciting thing for me and I think for the field. The diabetes prevention program was a study of 3,000 individuals with impaired glucose tolerance. We wanted to know whether it was possible to prevent the development of diabetes in these individuals, either through a lifestyle intervention, through diet and exercise, or by taking a medication, in this case, a medication called metformin, which is actually a diabetes medication. And we also had a third group that was a placebo condition. I was in charge of developing the behavioral treatment for that study, and we argued to do an intensive, extensive program, and really, if we were going to test a lifestyle intervention, do one that potentially could work. We worked on that study for years. It was actually 4 years of intervention for the patients, many more years of planning and publishing results. But throughout the entire study, I kept hoping that lifestyle would do as well as a diabetes medication. I never really considered the possibility that lifestyle intervention would beat a diabetes medication. So you can imagine the thrill that I had, and I think the thrill for the whole field of behavioral medicine, when the results were announced. And what we found was that lifestyle intervention reduced the risk of diabetes by 58% compared to placebo. And the medication reduced the risk of diabetes by 31% So, in a nutshell, lifestyle had done twice as well as medication in preventing diabetes. I think that was a turning point for me, and I hope it's really going to serve as a turning point for the field of behavioral medicine in recognizing just how important lifestyle intervention can be. Now, I mentioned before that I was president of the Society of Behavioral Medicine during the year 1992-93. Our annual meeting in 93 was held in San Francisco. Ken Perkins was the program chair, and we put together, I think, what was an outstanding program for that year. When I look back on the program, though, many of the topics we were thinking about and talking about are still the topics that we're interested in today. We had presentations on obesity, on smoking, on AIDS. A couple of probably more interesting things that we did was we had one presentation called The Great Cholesterol Debate, which was really looking at the National Cholesterol Education Program and considering whether diet really did work for cholesterol and looking at pros and cons of this cholesterol education program. We also had another symposium on voluntary versus mandated behavior change. It's been an interesting topic in the whole period between 93 and now, coming up with a lot of discussion over smoking, and now, right at this point, coming up with some interesting questions regarding obesity and our epidemic of obesity. So again, the whole question of voluntary versus mandated behavior change is still an important topic today. If you really asked me, though, what my memory of the meeting in 1993 was, it was actually nothing about the meeting at all. It was about the fact that when we completed the meeting and we all went to fly home, we found that there had been a major snowstorm on the East Coast, basically dumping over 24 inches of snow in many of the East Coast cities, closing every single airport on the East Coast. Here we were out in sunny California enjoying our meeting, but it took most of us 3 days in order to get home to find planes that could fly us back to the East Coast. So that's really the memory of the meeting in 93. I was asked to talk about what I considered the greatest challenge during my presidency as in the year 1993. I think really the challenge that I faced was to help SBM move administratively from being what was really a mom and pop shop to becoming really a big organization. And it was really in that period where we recognized that we had to take a step forward and begin to act and present ourselves as a major organization. And I hope that I was helpful in setting us on the path to becoming a more important organization as we are today. What advice would I give younger faculty, students who are here listening to this tape? Probably the advice that I would give is that our field is one that really requires you to have a tough skin. You've got to, if you don't have one now, you've got to develop a tough skin. Hopefully, over your career, you will have some wonderful successes. You'll get some manuscripts published, you'll get some grants funded, you'll treat some patients with behavior change techniques and really see improvements clinically. Hopefully, you'll experience some of those wonderful successes. But I can almost assure you that you will also experience some times where you're not so successful, where you submit that grant for the first time or the second time or even the third time and it's not funded, or the manuscript you think is so important just doesn't get accepted. Okay? You've got to realize that those are going to happen, that they happen not only to you beginning your career, but also to us as seasoned veterans in the field. We still get rejections. I think that's an important thing to realize. And if I had one thing to say to you, it's the fact that if you don't submit your grant, I know it won't get funded. You must try in order to possibly succeed. And that would be my one bit of advice that I give to all of you.
I'm Jackie Dunbar-Jacob from the University of Pittsburgh. I was president of the Society of Behavioral Medicine in the 1993-94 year. I was the first nurse to be elected president of the society. There were 3 issues that we addressed in particular during the time of my presidency. The first of those had to do with the professional diversity of membership in the society. And we decided in that particular year to go after nurses, to increase membership among that group. I believe that we were successful in increasing the number of nurses who were active participants in the society, and that subsequent years have continued to increase the number of nurses and nurse scientists who are interested in the Society of Behavioral Medicine and in behavioral medicine issues. We've seen an increasing number of nurses active in committees, presenting scientific papers at the professional organization conferences, and assuming an increasing number of leadership positions within the society. The second issue that we addressed during that particular year had to do with the organization of the science within the society for the annual conference. Up to that date, the society had addressed behavioral medicine through disease-specific forum, much like the NIH is organized. This particular year, we assumed as the theme for the conference cross-cutting issues in behavioral medicine. And we reorganized the structure of the science within the conference so that the cross-cutting issues became the primary focus rather than the specific disease. So for example, instead of presenting hypertension and issues related to weight, nutrition, exercise, adherence to treatment in hypertension, we looked at instead nutrition, weight, exercise, adherence to treatment, and so on across major disorders such as hypertension, diabetes, rheumatologic conditions, and so on. The cross-cutting issues have continued to remain an area of interest among members of the Society of Behavioral Medicine. The third issue, and perhaps the most important issue for the society at that point in time, had to do with the opening of the Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research at the NIH. Congress had enacted legislation creating that particular office at the NIH, but the NIH was showing some inertia in organizing a search committee to look for a first director and in opening the office itself. Together with the president of ABMR and the president of APS, I went to lobby at the NIH for the opening of a search committee to look for a director for the OBSSR office. We were successful in our lobbying efforts, and I ended up on the search committee for the first director of OBSSR, which opened the next year. The first director that was identified indeed was Norm Anderson, who later became one of our presidents in the Society of Behavioral Medicine. Let me take a moment to tell you a little about myself. I received my bachelor's degree in nursing at Florida State University and my master's degree at the University of California, San Francisco. Following that, I received my PhD in counseling psychology from Stanford University. During my time at Stanford, I worked as a research assistant and later had as a dissertation advisor Stewart Agras, who was to become the first president of the Society of Behavioral Medicine. In the mid-1970s, he labeled his work group, his research group, and his research lab as the Laboratory for the Study of Behavioral Medicine, an organization that actually preceded the naming of the professional organization itself. With his encouragement and his support, I became a member of the special interest group in behavioral medicine in AABT. That particular group broke off from the AABT and became the Society of Behavioral Medicine 25 years ago. I have been an active member of that organization since that time period, serving in a number of capacities on the board, as member at large, as secretary-treasurer, as committee chair, and following my presidency as an active participant in long-range planning. Since that time period, I have strongly encouraged my graduate students and junior faculty to become active members and participants in the Society of Behavioral Medicine, both through committee work and leadership activities, as well as through the presentation of scientific data at the annual conference meetings. The Society of Behavioral Medicine has made substantial contributions to our understanding of the health of the American public. It is an organization whose time has truly come in this, its 25th birthday. As the NIH is moving towards the new health research teams of the future, with an emphasis on interdisciplinary research, we know that behavioral medicine has been there, is there, and will be there. It's an organization that has been very good to me, and I believe to the other members. It's an organization we need to support and encourage, and an organization that will continue to make contributions over time. Thank you for your time.
I'm Richard Serwood. I'm professor and chief of the Division of Medical Psychology and vice chairman for research in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Duke University Medical Center. I did my PhD degree at McGill in Montreal. And McGill University was known at that time, it probably still is, but particularly back in the 60s and 70s, as one of the great institutions for neuropsychology and neuroscience. And I had the great fortune to study with D.O. Hebb, who really set a very high standard for what research should be. So I think that I have to list Dr. Hebb as one of the key mentors in terms of forming my view of the way science should be done. However, as a graduate student, I was really interested in behavior modification, and the whole notion of behavioral medicine really hadn't been developed yet. In my last year of graduate school, David Shapiro from Harvard University came to do a colloquium and presented his exciting findings on the instrumental conditioning of involuntary responses, particularly blood pressure and heart rate. And this work was so exciting to me that I applied to do a postdoctoral fellowship with Dr. Shapiro, which really began my career in behavioral medicine. And I'd have to say, of all my mentors, David Shapiro would be the key person. Mm-hmm. The other thing that was an enormous challenge for us was to really establish our own journal. When I came into office, Annals of Behavioral Medicine was actually a newsletter. And we spent a lot of time trying to decide whether we wanted to acquire an existing journal or really put our effort into making a journal. And we decided on the latter course, and now Annals is a wonderful publication under the leadership of Bob Kaplan, and we have established a journal for SBM. My presidential meeting was in San Diego, and we were staying at the spectacular Hyatt right on the waterfront. And we had actually displaced the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who was there for the America's Cup. And we had this spectacular suite overlooking the bay and the America's Cup race that had a long living room with a grand piano and bedroom on either end. And my kids came with us. And we were checking out the suite, moving our stuff in. My daughter came running down from her end of the suite to ours, complaining that she didn't have a piano in her room. So that we found was probably the funniest thing that happened to us at the time. I think that the most pressing challenge for SBM is twofold. I agree with something that Redford Williams said earlier. First of all, SBM needs to incorporate more basic science into what it calls behavioral medicine. We really need to be able to integrate what we do with the cutting edge of molecular biology and molecular genetics. The other thing is that we have to be able to make ourselves relevant to the healthcare community. And it isn't clear to me that we have done so effectively up until now. So SBM needs to come up, or behavioral medicine needs to come up with effective interventions that make the discipline of behavioral medicine a significantly relevant discipline in the age of the medical economics that we're going to see coming. The best advice I can give to students and to young faculty is really to take chances. To paraphrase Neal Miller, we need to think boldly in terms of what we dare do, but be conservative in terms of how we interpret the data. I think too many scientists, especially young ones, tend to get caught in the rut of Me Tooism, where they do little experiments that take off in a modest way from the work of their mentors. Now, while that's a safe way to go, it really doesn't push the field ahead. And I think we need more people to take leaps than we have seen in the past. I think this is a really good society, one that needs to bring in more interdisciplinary participation. We've been very successful at doing this over the years, but we need to be able to be more successful. We need to incorporate in our midst larger numbers of physicians from other disciplines. We need more endocrinologists. We need more immunologists. We have some cardiologists. We could use more of them. I think behavioral medicine needs a little more medicine as well as the behavior.
Good.
I would say integration with behavioral science is what I hoped would characterize my presidency. At our meeting in 1995, we had several presentations on molecular biology and genetics trying to set the tone for future meetings. And I hope that has influenced the way the society has gone from that point on. Well, at that time, I think the major word was fiscally challenged.
Okay.
But now, hopefully, that's no longer applicable. I would go back to what I said before. Integration with basic science is really where we need to be.
Hi, I'm Dr. Bar Taylor. I was the president of the Society of Behavioral Medicine during our 1996 meeting in Washington, D.C. About my mentors, Stewart Agras, who was involved in founding the Society of Behavioral Medicine, Mickey Stunkert, and Jack Farquhar have been my most important mentors in behavioral medicine. The question about the most significant challenges, in 1996, the Society for Behavioral Medicine decided to have a joint meeting with the International Society of Behavioral Medicine. This was their fourth meeting and the first one in which the two organizations had been together. It became a problem in some ways because the culture of the International Society was different from the Society of Behavioral Medicine in that they liked a formal opening ceremony and also liked to have special events such as dances and other acts that people could go to. So we decided that one thing we could do that would be very special for our European colleagues would be to have the Marine band perform during the opening ceremony. At that time, Dr. Segrist, who was the president of the International Society of Behavioral Medicine, was going to give the opening speech for the entire Congress, but I was in charge of the Marine National Band. Unfortunately, I wasn't entirely sure what the protocol was, so there was a time when I was sitting at the podium introducing the Marine Band. They played some great music, and then it was very clear that the entire audience was supposed to rise, and I had the problem of deciding how I'm going to signal all of these hundreds of people, many of them from other countries, that the tradition would be that they would stand when the Marine Marching Band was leaving. Actually, it worked pretty well, but then I had the problem of having people sit down, so I spontaneously came up with some hand signals to get everyone to go up and down in response to the Marine Band. The meeting itself went very well. We had wonderful talks from Michael Marmot and from Nancy Fraser-Smith and from Dr. Leshner, who was in charge of the National Institute of Drug Abuse. Dean Ornish was willing to give us a talk about his interest in aggressive lifestyle management for heart disease. We decided to have a banquet and to invite the Gross National Product, which was the comedy group in Washington, D.C. I was rather worried that this humor that was very much centered on making fun of American politicians would be well received by the European and Asian and other colleagues from around the world, but everyone seemed to really enjoy that very much. So the meeting was an enormous challenge in getting different groups with different ideas and cultures and methods of running meetings together, but we were very successful. Craig Ewart served for the Society of Behavioral Medicine and getting the program together, and Odd Oppels was involved with the International Society of Behavioral Medicine. Even that presented a problem in getting two organizations with somewhat different ideas about what the program should look like together to come up with the final agenda and program, but it was actually really good and very well received by everybody. The organizers of these videos asked me to discuss what I consider the most pressing issue and challenge in behavioral medicine is, and to me this is very clear, and that is to how we can create environments in which young men and women can become successful researchers. Many of us who began early in our careers in behavioral medicine did so at a time when there was a lot of excitement about the possibility of changing lifestyle. There was also a substantial amount of funding in order to develop large projects, and many of us were involved in incredibly exciting projects like the 5 Cities Project, in which we were trying to change the behavior of 100,000 people simultaneously. But these large projects with a vision that seemed to be more open, enthusiastic to these kinds of ideas in the 70s and 80s and even to the 90s made it possible for a number of us to have very successful careers. I think now the demands are much greater on young people, and our society needs to be very supportive of making it possible for men and women to pursue academic careers, to be able to have funding, to be able to take the time and thoughtfulness necessary to do the more complicated research that we engage in, and then to be successful in developing their academic careers. Much of what we have done in the last 20 years has become a part of medicine, and we may have lost sight of many of the contributions that we take for granted. Then the question was, what advice or encouragement would I give for young people starting out? For me, this is pretty simple, which is that when we begin to look at a particular problem, and most of us are involved with interventions and trying to change institutions, societies, behaviors, individuals, or to solve problems, but in beginning to develop such interventions, I think it's very important to ask who will use them, when will they be used, how will they be used, and to think very programmatically about what the end product is going to be and how this can be translated and incorporated into medical practice or psychological practice. It's difficult often to envision what are the steps necessary to get something from A to Z, but I think it's really important that we carefully consider what our end goals are going to be. Someone asked me for one word about the impact of the society, the challenges initially early on, and that would be influence. I think many of us remain concerned with the difficulty of changing nature of medical practice to incorporate a lot of the ideas that we have developed and demonstrated through evidence-based medicine. But at the same time, individuals in behavioral medicine have contributed to the rise of evidence-based medicine, which has now become very much a part of a practice. I've recently been running the adult psychiatry residency training program, and the ACGME, the American College of Graduate Medical Education, has established a series of competencies, not only in psychiatry, but all aspects of medicine, that begin to reflect in many ways the principles that those of us in behavioral medicine have struggled for many years in terms of being able to increase interpersonal skills, competency, professionalism, lifelong learning, and to be familiar with systems and evidence-based interventions. And then finally, a word about the Society of Behavioral Medicine that might reflect what we do, perhaps in distinction to other groups, and that word for me is translation. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure serving as your president and being part of the society for the last 25 years.
Happy anniversary, SBM. My name is Bob Kaplan, and I'm a professor and chair of the Department of Family and Preventive Medicine at the University of California in San Diego. I'm also the editor-in-chief of the Annals of Behavioral Medicine, and I was president of the SBM in 1996 and 1997. The most significant challenge for me was participating in sharing in conference calls while I was trying to do my email. My greatest achievement was talking Don Wilson into being program chair. I think the most pressing issue for SBM is finding a way to diversify their membership, both in terms of ethnic background, but also in terms of training of their membership. Actually, one of the things that happened when I was president was that we had a contractual dispute with a hotel in San Francisco just before the annual meeting. And we were forced to pay a fair amount extra for the facility. And we insisted that they provide a lot of extra food for this extra fee. So during the meeting, people were eating well, having a great time, thinking that this is all because we had planned it. there's going to be a great future in behavioral medicine research and practice. And I think that all of us need to learn to have fun and enjoy what we're doing and make important contributions for the next generation. So, happy anniversary, SBM.